You came from the financial services industry
Mhm.
and now you're in the tech industry. And one of the things I feel like has been, this is another maybe change management question. I think confusing for folks in, let's say, traditional industries like financial services or manufacturing is you look at these tech companies and it seems like they sort of launch stuff into orbit really quickly, and that, you know, old school industries, old school companies are, and I don't mean that in a pejorative way, just that they've been around and it's sort of a different business model, are struggling to catch up. Are there a couple of leadership observations that now, having done both, you could share with your former colleagues in financial services or other traditional line industries, what you've learned from being an executive leader in the tech sector, so that when everyone's sort of admiring that, is what they're seeing real? Is there a different way of thinking about it? What are some of the nuances or learnings there?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question because there are some, very, I think, stark differences between, right, industries that are, I would say, more highly regulated, in that there is a lot of boxes to check, compliance exercises to complete. In the tech sector, it's not as rigorous. Now, there still are definitely requirements for compliance and privacy and whatnot, but there's not as much formality in some of the mandates. You're not dealing with the OCC or the FRB or some of these other regulators that are so important to the financial services industry. So one piece of advice I would have for our financial services, friends, if you will, is really thinking about the power of why. Why are we really working on these data priorities? Is it to check a box, or is there a business value proposition that, I think, at least in my experience, sometimes gets pushed to the wayside? And so just really thinking about, why are we doing these different programs? How is that benefiting the user, the customer, and just always having that customer driven lens? That sometimes gets lost in the regulatory, mandates or the drivers. We certainly saw that in the data space with BCBS 239 and some of the other regulations that came up out of the financial crisis as being like the driver to data maturation, and really thinking about it in terms of what does the user need, and really thinking about why we're doing the things that we are, and not getting lost in that bureaucracy or that extra governance that comes with just being a very highly regulated industry. I think in the tech sector, you see that that more of that user experience, customer experience being the main driver. And so just having that, that shift in paradigm of really thinking about why we're doing these things, what is the real impact, not necessarily being to check a regulatory box, but because it makes life better. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And that's the distinction I saw coming into the tech sector, is you really get to think about, the value and not as much of the compliance aspect. And I think that's really, really exciting as part of the driver for me to move into tech.
I think that's a great insight, and I love that way of thinking about it. And I was in before I was in technology, I was in life sciences for a long time, so I had kind of a similar experience with the heavy and appropriately so regulatory framework. But it just too often, I agree, kind of becomes an end in itself, and you end up with the tail wagging the dog. And I like that lens of what's the customer experience or what's the business experience. The other thing that a journey that we went through about 10 years ago was sort of thinking about compliance risk tiering, and what things are really important and absolutely need to be bulletproof, as opposed to what things got kind of added on. And I think there's an interesting thought process where, if you were to take your suggestion, kind of dimensionalize that with, what's the compliance requirement, what's the risk profile, and then how does that attach to some customer value or customer experience? That's an interesting way of thinking about it. Let me go in a slightly different direction if I can, and I'll sort of share with you first a mental model that I've had a long time on the concept of architecture. And I think VMware's got a very interesting place in what I would consider an enterprise architecture. So when I think of architecture, I think of, there's a physical architecture, so you have buildings. There's a social and people architecture. You have relationships. There's a legal entity, a tax regulatory architecture. There's obviously a business process architecture. There's an application architecture, which maybe is what most IT folks spend most of their time thinking about when they hear the word architecture. Underlying that, there's an infrastructural, or what used to be called a hosting architecture, and then there's a data architecture. In thinking about this for, probably 10, 15 years, I feel like the data architecture and data interoperability often get sort of short shrift and not thought of in looking at that overall architectural situation. So where I think you may have an interesting dog in the fight here is that part of your core value proposition is around app rationalization and the digitization of underlying technical infrastructure. Within that new set of capabilities that you bring to your customers, what's your perspective on how companies get data right or how companies get data wrong?
Yeah, I think a lot of times we have this mindset that we have to physically move data together to get the value out of it. And I see that a lot in the data, practice, if you will, and that, we think we need to take copies of data or actually physically move it to a centralized area in order to be able to get what we need from it. And I think as we're seeing more things done on the edge, more IoT type technologies emerging, a lot more data than we've ever seen before, that becomes a bit impractical. And I think it drives the importance of, how do we glean that value and really understand our data in a way without having to move it. And so what I think we're going to see a lot more in the industry, both with our customers and, internally, certainly with our own business, is how do you govern and glean that value without moving the data? And I think that's going to increase the value proposition of metadata and really understanding what data you have where, and really driving that almost that indexing capability of good, clear data definitions, understanding where all your customer information is and resides, how we protect it on the edge. So I think security will go through some sort of a, continued maturation as far as how we protect data where it's captured, even more so than in the past. And so I do think we'll see this more disparate data architecture emerging, and an increase in focus in how do we really get our arms around all of the data that exists across our organizations and being able to manage it there where it lives, instead of having to bring it together to build, whatever analytics or insights we need to run our companies.